15. 2 Timothy 2:14 and 15. Of these things put them in remembrance, charging them before the Lord, that they strive not about words to no profit, but to the subverting of the hearers. Study to show thyself approved unto God, a workman that needs not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. That is my favourite preaching verse in the whole Bible. It's sort of a motto, if you like, that I've tried to hang over all my studies and sermon preparation. There's so much good stuff in it. The need for study, of course. The aim, God words, to show yourself approved to God, keeping that as your focus. A workman, emphasizing the need for hard labor, sweat, toil, tears, blood. That need not be ashamed, gives a boldness. Good preparation leads to confident preaching. And this particularly, rightly dividing the word of truth. I think that's one of the primary aims of preaching, to be a divider. To take the word of God in its lumps as it comes to us and to break it down into digestible, edifying portions, organized in a way that is useful and memorable to our hearers. And there's much more there too, but try to make that a very prominent verse throughout your ministries. It's a lifetime to obey it. Let's pray. We thank you, Lord, for calling us to this work, and pray that this class might be a means of obeying this verse, to study, to show ourselves approved unto God. We pray for all the skills and all the discipline and all the character that we need to fulfill this requirement. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, my part of the course is going to be taught mainly using the model of a flipped classroom, which means primarily that you will be doing lecture content outside of class, and then we will be working on exercises within class. But for that to work, the lectures have got to be watched and listened and digested outside of class. And thus far, I haven't been very encouraged in the use of this model in the seminary. The work is basically not done by some students. And so if this is going to work, I need to know that there's commitment on your side to this. And if not, then we will revert to me just standing here telling you what's already in my book and on these videos, and then we can't use class time to really drive in the lessons, work it out practically, and so on. So I want to begin today by handing you out pen and paper. If you want to write your name at the top. Do you have a pen? If you don't have a pen, just shout. I've got a bundle here. A pen? I want you to shut your laptops, phones, iPads, memory chips. Yep. This is not an examination. You will not be marked on this. Sure. Yeah, I'm the same. I don't carry one around normally now. That's strange. So yeah, this is not an exam, but I need to know, and I'll check this up regularly, if the work is being done as required by the course, so that if not, then we have to revert to the more traditional model. So name at the top, and then 5 minutes, no more than 5 minutes. I want you to write down the steps outlined in the 2 videos that were to be watched prior to this class. As many steps as you can. I think there were 18. If you can get half of that, good and well. But I'd like to see what has been assimilated before we go on. So the 2 videos, what is the step-by-step outline? If you didn't watch them, then you can write me a confession on the sheet of paper and hand that in to him. Okay. Okay, let's call it a day at that. If you want to just pass your papers along to the end of the... Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Let me give you the 18 steps. Thank you. The main benefits of this exercise are to help you recognize the need for a routine in sermon preparation. Now, some of you will have that. Some of you have been preaching for a while. But even those who have been preaching for a while, often it's a bit ad hoc and varies depending on mood, etc. For those of you also who have been preaching for a while, maybe you're not in the best routine. There's another one you might want to consider. But I want you to really labor to see the benefits of repetition, regularity, and routine. Oftentimes when people think of preachers, they think of them sort of sitting in a room, cross-legged, in a sort of meditative pose, umming away and just waiting for the sermon to drop from the sky. And it just, as we know, doesn't happen. But there can be a wee bit of that even in some of us with a more mystical bent. And that leads to bad habits. It leads to panic stations as well. And it's like everything in life. The more we get into routine, a regularity, an order, the easier it becomes and the less of a mountain it becomes to us in our week. And that's another reason for breaking this down so much. And that is when you look at sermon prep, especially at the beginning, it does seem unclimbable. But breaking it down step by step in a logical progression helps you to take one step, then a second, and eventually get to the top of the mountain. So the first step, now, first of all, just an apology for these videos. I hope you weren't laughing too loud at me in them. That was a rather young David Murray, I don't know what, probably 8 years ago. I think probably you can still hear a bit of Highland twang in my voice, Highland accent compared to what I have now. Sometimes I'm very tempted just to eliminate all these things from the internet, but I think there's some value in it if you can get past the me in it. But anyway, first step was layout, you remember, just basically laying out a sheet of paper with the text at the top, or a part of the text at the top, your Roman numerals, a structure. Yeah, that's the Roman numerals really. 3 I usually start with an intro and a conclusion. Dividing the text up into its various phrases and clauses, text division. Fourthly, looking at translations, for different English translations of the text that we're working at, putting them beside the version that we're working with. Then looking at original languages, and there I'm arguing for a repositioning of the biblical languages, and I'm going to return to this shortly. Then organizing the material, working on an introduction is number 7. Number 8 is interrogation. Let me go back to number 6. I don't think I explained that well enough. When I'm saying organization there, I'm saying we should be working from the earliest point in our sermon preparation to get a sermon structure, rather than we just work, get 10, 20, 30 pages of just an amorphous glob of information, and then to try and start organizing that is well nigh impossible and very inefficient. And it's not to say you don't change your initial structure as you go along, but in terms of organizing the information you're studying, it's really helpful as early as you can to get some provisional sermon structure. So layout number 1, 2, structure your page, 3, divide the text, 4, look at various translations, 5 original languages, 6 organization, 7 introduction, looking at both a technical introduction and homiletical, but mainly at this point, the technical introduction. Then we move to interrogation, exegesis. Then we look at cross-references, number 9. Number 10, we start addressing some of the problems, questions, unresolved issues of the text. Number 11, looking at Bible dictionaries and commentaries. Notice how far down the list that is. Sorry, I've put unresolved issues there twice. Next number is 12 then, summarize, which is taking the material we've got, and we're aiming here for brevity, clarity, things in the right order of priority, a logic. We're trying to condense, we're trying to cut, we're trying to concentrate. Then 13 application. 14, trying to find quotations, illustrations, other scripture references we might use. Number 15, final questions. Looking at balance. Do we have the right balance between head, heart, and hand? Do we have the right balance between addressing the different varieties of people in our congregation, whether it's old Christians or new Christians, unconverted? Have we arranged this and written this in the most thought-provoking way, logical way? Have we decided where we really want to place our emphasis? Like where we're really going to be fired up, as far as we can tell at that stage. 16, memorize. 17, personalize, which is to do with hearing other sermons on the text, praying over it, praying for our congregation. Now, I took down notes on some of the answers that you submitted via Populi, and I just want to highlight some of them. I won't use names, but just, I think, helpful little nuggets that many of you have picked up in your own experience of organizing a sermon. And we always think it's helpful to do this early in the course. It's tempting to sort of, do the individual bits of sermon prep and then give an overview at the end, but we felt early on that we would give this big overview of the whole process. Even if it's provisional and it changes along the way, and then we work on the individual parts of it, like tomorrow we move to choosing a text. So this is very much introductory, big picture stuff. One student said that the selection of a passage will often come from my personal devotions, which I think is a very common way for pastors to find texts. Again, this student says, read through the passage to create an initial structure and understanding. Again, underlining this value of trying to get this structure early on in the preparation. Looking for 3 to 4 simple and memorable points that help clarify the message of the passage. That's the point of points. It's to help clarify the message. So we're looking at our points and we're asking, does this clarify the message? Then I look for a major illustration for each major point. If you can do that, that's wonderful. I wish I did more of that myself. And then mention is made of Stuart Olliott's recommended order: state, illustrate, apply. State the point, illustrate the point, apply the point. And this student also mentions how he listens to 2 or 3 sermons on the passage. So that's very helpful. This student says, I usually have 3 to 4 texts that I'm actively meditating on to preach from soon. Again, there's a good idea. Instead of just focusing on the very next sermon, then try and have a few bubbling away that your mind can be working on, you can be working on in your spare time as you're driving and so on. And it's not to say you will definitely preach on these 3 or 4, but if you've got 3 or 4 bubbling away, you're working on it in your mind. Then maybe even if one or two fall out and you think, nah, I'm not getting anything from that, at least you've got one or two to fall back on. And also mention is made here, I write out my sermon notes on 4x6 note cards, as I find that I connect better with the congregation in my delivery that way than by reading from 8x11 sheets of paper. So I give you one method in my lectures, the video lectures. Here's another. And again, you've got to find the best way for you. And a lot of this, not all of homiletics, but a lot of homiletics is looking at a range of possibilities and experimenting. And even if you have been preaching a bit, you should use this semester to experiment, to break away from patterns and habits you've been using, try something fresh, venture forth, risk it a bit, especially if you're preaching in a less formal situation like a nursing home or a jail, and just see what works. You might discover something that really fits you well and helps you. Then this student said, I do not have a pattern of sermon preparation. So of course that's needed here, something to build on. But I liked what this student said. I didn't stay all day long at home. I rode my bike every night for about 1 hour, and I was meditating on all my reading and all I'd collected at the same time. I stopped any time I had an idea and used my cell phone to record it. After I got back home, I wrote down all these thoughts on notes from the recording. I don't know if I mentioned this in the lectures, but for myself, many of my own best sermon insights came when I broke away from my studies and I went for a walk on the beach just down the road from my home in the Isle of Lewis. And I think this student really confirms a well-attested scientific point that if all you do in sermon prep is what you do at your desk, it's going to be boring and predictable. And you're not opening yourself up to the benefits of a rest from the material and the eureka moment. Almost every major creative breakthrough in history has come away from the thing that the person's been working on. So this idea of getting out, getting some fresh air, getting the blood flowing, that too can be sermon prep and sometimes the most helpful sermon prep. I wasn't sure about stopping to use my cell phone every few minutes on a bike. I wouldn't risk that around here for sure. Then the student says, of all the materials I chose finally from my notes, only one short sentence or even just some key words for each of them. Each page listed only one subtopic and all keywords printed with bold and easy to follow fonts. I could catch a glimpse of the current page and get all I need to speak on this subtopic. So here's a student who's working on condensing, summarizing, and having a method so that when preaching, there's not an overdependence on notes, and there's some trigger words or sentences that will, fire them off in the right direction. I like this, the way this was put. After the whole manuscript is written, go through and lower vocabulary. Lower vocabulary, something that's really needed when we're at seminary, because we are speaking with a vocabulary that no one else in this world is speaking, well, very few in our world is speaking with. So very important you recognize that and that you tone it down. And as it said here, make it more in common spoken English than written. And you say, well, how do I tell the difference? Well, try reading your sermon. And you'll find often if your sermon is in written form that you'll be catching your breath at points, trying to say a whole sentence. You'll realize, hey, this sentence is far too long for spoken word. I need to chop this up. I need to make this smaller. It's one of the easiest ways to discover if you have an oral form or a written form. Just stand up and read it and see if breathing comes naturally, or you're just about dying by the end of sentences. Yeah, this came across a lot, which I was glad to see. Prayer for a text. Prayer for a text. I mean, it seems basic. Surely every minister does it. But you'll find it's easy to get out of that habit. So start it and keep it going. Reading through the passage a few times in order to get a grasp of the passage. Do this in advance of actual sermon preparation time to allow the passage to marinate as you go about the week. So, say you do your sermon prep, as I used to do on Friday, Saturday. I'm not waiting until Friday, Saturday to start thinking about a text. I'm looking for that as soon as I'm finished preaching on Sunday, usually. Definitely Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday latest, and just having it with me on a card or memorized. And again, it's amazing. The mind is working on that, even if you're not consciously working upon it. Again, we'll get to this. Write down all questions about the passage in a side column. So here's students writing the text on one side of a piece of paper and leaving a column for questions. Not answers, notice, questions to be researched later. Again, this student says take a break. So important that you just step away, give the mind a breather, and often the insights will come. And then this was repeated in some of the later answers too. Practice the sermon out loud with the manuscript and then with the bullet point sheet. I think I've only ever done that once in my life, and it didn't help me. I found it very unnatural. But I'm not saying don't do it. What I am saying is I'll be very surprised if you can continue to do that, given time constraints. But it may be a good practice, especially early on, when you're just starting out. A lot of it may be a confidence issue. And as you grow in confidence, you'll realize the Lord will help you. And you don't need to go through that stage of actually speaking it out loud. Another one here, personal devotion through the week. And I'll get to that today, later on. So important. It's easy to think of sermon preparation in a box over here, but it's not. It's within the bigger box of our Christian life. Read the text multiple times, then I would use some commentaries. This will be emphasized and underlined and highlighted and emboldened throughout exegesis classes, but we really want to encourage you at the seminary here to put commentaries as far down the line as possible. We are not discouraging the use of commentaries, but what you will find is that your sermons are freshest to you and to your hearers when you have used commentaries later in the process. If you go straight to commentaries or go too early, it's not you. It's not the thoughts God has given you. It's not the way you think. It's like trying to walk in other people's shoes. It will end up that you will need far more notes to depend on when you start preaching as well, because again, it's not come as it were naturally out of yourself. We're living in a day, and especially some of us are in cultures where there's a lot of familiarity with Bible texts and commentaries, and people will tell. People can tell a commentary sermon. And we want to really try and break that, because it's stale. And even when using commentaries, that it not just be a cut and paste, but it actually comes through us, that it's processed by us. And the thought, yes, came from someone else maybe, but the expression of the thought comes more naturally from ourselves. Again, mention of reading it multiple times loudly, trying to memorize it, because not wanting to read line by line. One student made mention of a system. I've seen it, but I have never looked into it. But within the Logos system, there's Logos in Sermon Preparation is the name of the system. And you can learn, I think there's an add-on to Logos that you can buy, if I recall. that creates a layout for you in terms of the steps to go through in sermon prep. And this student said he found it very helpful, eventually morphing it into his own system and his own process. Here a student says, I finish by considering the title of the sermon, which also should be easy to remember, so that when the hearer goes back to the passage later on, he can easily recall the sermon on that passage. And we'll talk about sermon titles at some point in this course, but it's a very important part of sermon preparation. It may not feel like it to you, but in some ways it's a test of you. Have you really got it down to a short, pithy statement that can summarize what you're saying? Is there a real message that can be encapsulated in a short statement? That's a huge challenge. It might be the shortest sentence in your paper, and yet it's often the hardest to craft. So it's a test for you, but it's also, as this student points out, a big help to hearers. So that when the hearer goes back to the passage later on, he can easily recall the sermon on that passage. And Stephen Lee told me, he's the guy that heads up sermon audio, the single greatest determinant of whether people will listen to your sermon posted in sermon audio is the title. I'm not saying that's a good thing, but that's the thing. That's the reality. And it's all very well being humble and saying, I'm not going to. We want people to listen to our sermons, guys. What's the point in putting the work into it? So we want to get that message out. You want to get that heard. If it's better than other sermons there, it's worth putting the time in to get that title. One student says, worshiping the Lord for the work which is done. Again, to do this in a spirit of worship. A nice thought here. I would pray that the Lord would correct error and help me to rightly apply the word to his people's hearts. It's important, considering our fallibility. And that's about it. So thank you for your work that you did in that. I learned myself. I hope that you're picking up, so much homiletics, just picking up a little thing here and there through the years that will make a big difference to you and just maybe freshen up your preaching, revolutionize your approach to it. And I should say, if you didn't listen or watch to these lectures, please go and do it. Now, I've put the text for your sermons up on Homiletics I. You'll find under the info tab. I think it's called Student Text or something like that. And you'll find your name there with a text for Sermon 1 and a text for Sermon 2. And the text for Sermon 1 is the sermon you'll be working on throughout the class. That's the sort of hand-holding sermon. And the text for Sermon 2 is the one you're working on independently on your own that you will submit, I think, just a couple of weeks later than the first one. So Sermon 1 is the text that you will be working with in this class. You should be prepared to come to class with the work required in the assignments so that you can demonstrate that and use it as a teaching exercise for the rest of the students in the class. We won't get through everybody. Every class, for example, when we do a sermon introduction and I ask you to prepare that, you have to come prepared for that, but it's a much smaller class than we had the last time. So it's possible we might get through you all, but you have to be prepared to come up here and give a sermon introduction that will then be critiqued or praised, depending on how well you get on. And the whole idea here is that many students have complained that when they go into practice preaching, for some it's the first time they've ever preached a sermon of that length, and they're doing it in front of their peers and the professors, and it's just a momentous challenge. It's understandably difficult and stressful. So the idea is to break this down and help you do it in little chunks here in a less challenging environment. And basically you're juggling in one ball, and then we add another, and then we add another, so that we don't ask you to juggle 15 balls all at once. So again, the value of the class will largely depend on how much you put into it outside the class. And help your fellow students too by coming well prepared so that you can give a good example for them to follow also. Any questions about that so far? Okay. Tomorrow, we are going to be working on choosing a text. I want you to watch the lectures before the class. And then in the class, we'll do some exercises in that area. So I'll ask you to be choosing some text. Come with your Bibles tomorrow. And we'll work on choosing appropriate text for appropriate subjects, delimiting texts, how long, how short they should be, where they start, where they finish. But for the rest of today, I'd like to give a brief lecture on what I call faithful sermon preparation in a busy ministry. I should say before I start that I'm working on a page on the internet. It'll be linked to my blog, of preaching resources under each of the headings, things like structure, delivery, application. And there you will find all the best online articles that I've gathered over the last 7 years. And there are hundreds of them. But categorized so that you'll have a good resource there, a good database of material for the present, but also going into the future as well. And you should regularly in your ministry really focus in on one area of your preaching. Say, take 6 months to read books on how to introduce a sermon, and to listening to many sermons and seeing and hearing the different introductions. Or for myself, my weakest point, I believe, is conclusions. I don't know why that is. I think by the time I get to the end of the sermon preparation process, I'm just so done in. I think, I've done all that, and I feel I often just crawl over the finish line rather than burst through the line. For me, that should be the area I'm working on. How to conclude a sermon in a way that will be more powerful, more memorable, more sealing of the message. Or it might be exegesis, or it might be original languages, but just have a plan. Look at these various areas of constructing a sermon, and be structured in your future study of them. In many ways, all we're doing in this class is making you aware of these different components of a sermon and getting you off the starting blocks. But for you to really run well, you need to get more mental fuel on these subjects. Again, I'm hoping to put together a reading list that will sort of say we do sermon introductions, that will show you page numbers of the best books on that subject. Again, I hope that will really set you up for many years, decades of future study. Okay? So let's look at this. Again, we're looking at big picture stuff here. Faithful sermon preparation in a busy ministry. In a way, the title really doesn't work. Faithful sermon preparation, busy ministry, don't easily fit together. Often one is sacrificed. So somebody gives up faithful sermon preparation because their ministry is so busy. Or someone gets so focused on faithful sermon preparation that they basically do no ministry. That's two extremes, but often we fall into them. So how do we hold these two forces together? They seem to be pulling apart. How do we keep them together? Well, first of all, we've got to remember this. Faithful sermon preparation and busy ministry is, number one, painfully realistic. Painfully realistic. Now, some of you do not want to hear what I'm going to tell you, but you'll remember I told you in a few years' time. When I first went into pastoral ministry, it was idyllic. I was called to a small congregation in the middle of nowhere, the very undemanding people and good elders. It was just set up. It was just tremendous. So sat down my first morning, made my color-coded timetable. I had 2 or 3 hours every day devoted to just general reading, not sermon prep, but general reading. A daily time also scheduled for Greek and then Hebrew. I was reading a wide range of subjects, old and new. And then there were these really nice long sections. They were colored red. I remember it so vividly. About 15 hours per sermon preparation. It was a beautiful timetable. And then ministry started happening. Phone calls began. Visits that took twice as long as I'd planned for. Hospital visits, which for me there was a 90-minute drive there and a 90-minute drive back because they were in a town they were in Inverness. Presbytery meetings, committee meetings, reports, papers, problems in neighbouring churches, problems on a denominational level, getting asked to write for denominational magazines. Then a huge church controversy that blew up that actually eventually resulted in our church being split in two. Add on a couple of children in 2 years and a new church building project that we began, and my beautiful timetable just bit the dust. I think it lasted 3 or 4 weeks. And one of the exercises we'll do in this class, in ministry class, some of you are in that, is we'll look at your ideal week of ministry. I'll ask you to do what I did. I've kind of given you an advantage here, but I remember there was one student who had 30 hours of sermon prep time a week, no family time, no day off. And it's one of my joys when I start dismantling these timetables. And but idealism persists. I heard one really famous American preacher say at a big conference full of pastors, there must have been 300 in the room, that no sermon should be preached that had not had at least 35 hours devoted to its preparation. And that it should be practiced 6 to 8 times before preaching. Practiced 6 to 8 times before preaching. Well, I just saw all these heads just slump of all these pastors. But, here's a man, he's just floating in celebrity unreality and has completely forgotten what ordinary pastoral ministry looks like. So, let's get real. And it's painful. I mean, all of us would love to be able to do the 15, 20 hours per sermon, but it's not going to happen. If in ministry you get to spend 10 hours per sermon, you're doing really well. Really well. Most often it's going to be something in the region of 7 to 8 hours. Sometimes, I'm afraid it's going to be 5 to 6 hours, depending on needs and demands. Some of you are going to have to prepare 3 sermons a week. That's what I had to do, my first charge. And my second. In fact, my first one, every second week, I had 4 sermons to prepare. That was 2 in my main church on Sunday, 1 in a preaching station, which people in the morning church came to, so I couldn't repeat. And then I had a prayer meeting address as well, which was a half hour. So, how do you do that? Well, you just have to cut your time down, or else you run yourself into the ground. And that's okay. Not all sermons are equal. Some sermons, doctrinal sermons, are going to take a lot more time than a more, say, devotional sermon. or a practical sermon. We've got to be realistic and accept that. I know of one pastor who only survived a few years in the ministry. He was just a year or two ahead of me in seminary because he was trying to prepare every single sermon as he had been taught in seminary, following every single step for every single sermon. And it ended up that he was spending about 40 hours on a sermon. This was before the days of electronic help, so he's parsing and all this with all these parsing guides. He didn't have Logos. And eventually he put himself under so much pressure that he dreaded the sermon preparation so much that it made him ill. Eventually he's off for stress, goes off for 3 months, comes back, lasts another 2 weeks, off for 6 months, back, lasts about a month, eventually out of the ministry. And it's really a tragedy. He was a gifted guy, but he was just totally unrealistic about the kind of time available to us for sermon preparation. So I'm trying to be honest with you. I'm trying to help you face reality. It will, at the moment, sound horrendous because you're taking 15, 20, 25 hours to prepare a sermon. But remember, some of you are just starting off. It's like a toddler. You take a long time to move from A to B. When you're older, you can walk that much more quickly. You're also, over the years of ministry, gathering so much knowledge and experience that feeds into every text you read. You're not having to read books for knowledge that you don't have. The knowledge is there. So you will see expertise accelerate you, and your knowledge will save you a lot of time. You will learn healthy shortcuts. You will learn how to give different time to different kinds of sermons. And so it won't be quite as bad as you think it is just now. And if you're to ask Dr. Beakey, Dr. Bilkis, myself, how much time we spend on sermon preparation today compared to how we began, we're probably at about half of where we were then. I don't think our sermons are half as bad. Maybe sometimes they are, but the Lord helps as well. And it's not an excuse for laziness. It's not to say, well, only a couple of hours. I know men who, they do 15 minutes here, 15 minutes there, and it just doesn't work. So it's painfully realistic. Number 2, this is more encouraging, I hope. It requires personal preparation. Personal preparation. Okay, you're disappointed. You were looking forward to these long, lazy hours in the study with these old books and crafting these beautiful sermons. Now I've told you how little time you're going to have. Well, I want to now encourage you by trying to think of preparing sermons in a much broader way than maybe you have done before. I want you to think of sermon preparation as something much more than just sitting at a desk with your computer or your quill and pen and a few old books. That sure is sermon preparation time, but if that's the only time you're preparing a sermon, then your sermons will suffer and so will your hearers. So I want you to think of the whole week as sermon preparation. Because a large part of sermon preparation is personal preparation. It's preparing yourself as well as your sermon. Preparing yourself as well as the sermon. Apart from exceptional situations, rare occasions, Christian preaching is different to all other kinds of public speaking in that the character of the messenger is so tied up with the effectiveness of the message. So we must prepare ourselves. That means personal devotions, family devotions are part of sermon preparation. They are a means of grace. They're bringing you into contact with God and His Word. They're bringing you into His presence. That it's not like, that's my devotions and there's my family devotions away over there on the left and sermon preparation is somewhere away out there on the right. No, it's all sermon preparation. It's all together. They're all in the same team. They're all interplaying one with another. Often, your family devotions, your personal devotions, as was said by one of the students, will give you your text. It will at least give you ideas. It will give you passion. It will give you zeal. It will give you contact with God. It will put reality into your sermons. Secondly, cultivate a meditative spirit as you go about your ministry. So take the text with you as you drive. Think of it as you go to sleep, as you shower. It's amazing how many sermons come to you in the shower. And it's also been proven scientifically. Often if you're thinking about something when you go to bed at night and you've got a problem, you wake up in the morning, lo and behold, you've got a solution. That's because your subconscious is working away, unknown to you. And so again, what we think about last thing at night, let that little machine that's working away in the background do some work for you while you sleep. Cultivate, thirdly, a holy life, thirdly, is also a part of sermon preparation. Holiness is the greatest exegete of the Bible. Holiness is the greatest exegete of the Bible. It's the key to interpreting the Bible. There's only so much that academic study of the text can give you. Remember, Jesus said, if anyone wills to do his will, he shall know concerning the doctrine, whether it is from God or whether I speak in my own authority. Get that? If anyone does his will, he will know. So here there's a link, isn't there, about doing God's will, being obedient, the process of sanctification, and knowledge. And Jesus here has linked them, and he's saying there are elements of knowledge and insight and discernment and interpretation that are inaccessible to the ungodly man, and yet that are accessible to sometimes the least gifted academically, because God reveals things to babes. You also have John 14:21. He who has my commandments and keeps them, it is he who loves me, and he who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I will love him and manifest myself to him. That's what we want, isn't it? We want to go into our studies and have Christ manifested to us. And here he's saying, well, this is one of the ways, obedience. So if we live a holy life, God will open up his word to us in a way that no amount of hours ever will. There are computer sermons and there are communion sermons. And we can often tell the difference, and so can our hearers. Personal preparation. Third point here is faithful sermon preparation, busy pastoral ministry prioritizes sermon prep. An old minister once told a young minister, feed the sheep and you won't hear them bleating. So you keep sheep's bellies filled, they're not going to be baaing and yelling at the shepherd. And what he meant was, you keep your people fed, you will keep problems to a minimum. And therefore it means we have got to prioritize the feeding of the sheep God has given us. I've seen very promising ministries ruined because the pastor just didn't feed his sheep. He didn't prioritize sermon preparation. I've tried to underline the difficulty of this. It ain't going to happen unless This is priority number one. So it doesn't matter really how many people you visit, how many people you evangelize, how many churches you plant, however popular you are with the youth, if you don't feed the sheep, they're going to start bleating. On the other hand, a church can get through tons of problems and difficulties if the sheep are being fed and satisfied. So, whatever we do, we must do this. Whatever else, if we do nothing else, we have to do this well. So nothing must get in the way of sermon preparation time. We won't have the ideal schedules we thought we might have when we were in seminary, but we must still schedule. We must schedule our week. So set apart times and make them as fixed as a doctor's appointment. As fixed as a doctor's appointment. Everything else is worked around sermon preparation time. And try to make it regular times. I've emphasized this already, but if you do this at the same time each week, in the same place each week, there's something that cues our brain so that when that time comes around and that place, that environment is entered, the brain says, right, I'm up, I'm ready, I'm rolling. There's a habit element to this that will, again, greatly improve your efficiency. They should be large sections of time, so scheduled times, regular times, large times. Minimum of 3-hour time slots for sermon preparation. That's 3 hours at a time. You're just not going to get depth if you're doing sermon prep in 15-minute, 30-minute, even 1-hour blocks. For most of us, there's a momentum to our studies. We get going slowly and we build a speed and we enter into a zone, as it were. That happens in sermon preparation too. And make sure they are the best times of the week. Our high performance times. For most people, not all people, but for most people, that's first thing in the morning. That's when the brain is most alert usually and most productive. You might want to look up on the internet R.C. Sproul productivity tips. I noticed just a few weeks ago he'd written on this time management. The thing that transformed his productivity as a pastor and preacher was starting to go to bed at 8 or 9 in the evening and getting up at 3 in the morning. Some of us can't do that for family reasons, but the point is made. Early to bed, early to rise, makes a good man healthy, wealthy, and wise. It's basic common sense. Also, they should be uninterrupted times. So you tell your family, you tell your elders, you maybe even tell your congregation that there are times in the week that are virtually sacrosanct. That it must take, there's a murderer in the house before you come and help your wife or something, Just, it's not just that will help you at the time. It will help you going into the time. We used to find here in the seminary before the extension it was almost impossible to get work done here of any quality, any intellectual, spiritual quality, not just because there were regular interruptions, but even when there weren't, we were expecting them. And your mind just doesn't get into fourth gear when you know you're going to have a break put on you every now and again. So it's important not just that it be uninterrupted, but that you know it's going to be uninterrupted. Phone off, voicemail off, email off, text off, whatever off you need to get you on this track. This faithful sermon preparation will never happen without faithful time management and self-discipline. And it'll amaze you how much you can get done when you operate like that. Number 4, this faithful sermon preparation and busy ministry? Plans ahead. Again, this was mentioned in some of the answers. Plans ahead. I didn't do an awful lot of consecutive expository preaching in Scotland. It wasn't kind of a thing in the Highlands. It was sort of viewed as a wee bit unspiritual. You know, that you're planning weeks ahead what you're going to preach. You know, where's the Lord in this? Do you not listen to him? And so on. And I think probably personally it suited me. I much prefer to preach texts that really gripped me and caught my attention. My own readings or whatever. But that didn't mean that I waited till Friday or Saturday to pick a text. I was thinking at least a week ahead. I was in fact trying to store up texts. I used to keep a little booklet. So any text that really gripped me, and even if I had a little skeleton that quickly formed in my mind, I would write that down. Maybe even a title if I had one. So that, you know, if I did get to Friday and still didn't have a text, I had some kind of store there. And oftentimes I'd go back and think, oh, I have no idea why that text meant anything, or I don't even understand that outline. But oftentimes there was something there that, you know, jumped out and got me going. But I'm looking all the time for a text. I'm looking morning, noon, and night when I'm visiting, in counselling situations, reading books. Sometimes I'd be gathering 10 possible texts in the course of a week, ultimately coming down to only needing 2 or 3 of them. Some never became sermons at all. But the point I'm making is I'm planning ahead. I'm not waiting till the last minute. And you're probably not as free-spirited as I was then. You're probably more in the modern mold of this consecutive expository approach. Some men are planning 2 or 3 weeks ahead. I've heard of some planning months ahead. Dr. Beakey, I think, plans 6 months ahead in his sermons. And that saves you a lot of time in weekly text selection. You know, if you're one of the exercises you're going to do is plot out an expository preaching series in a small book. It's not to say that's inviolable and set in stone, but that saves you a lot of time in a week in terms of picking a text. But you know, even if you do the consecutive expository approach and you don't need to be looking for a text, you should still be planning ahead, especially looking at passages that are going to be problematic down the line, because you tend to cover more difficult, problematic passages through consecutive expository preaching. And so you don't want to get to, you know, the question on head coverings or women in ministry and you've just got your usual 7 hours of study. You need a lot more for these kinds of issues, and you want to get ahead. Also, you want to try and preserve the fruits of your study. This will help you also in this planning ahead. Build up databases of information on various theological issues and subjects, so that when you come to a text that touches on, say, head coverings or adoption or the Lord's Supper, whatever, you know where to go. You've got a file, maybe a paper file of articles or references, maybe a spreadsheet you're keeping of page numbers. So you read a book, you enter the relevant sections. For myself, I've moved so much of my reading onto Kindle and Logos. A lot of that is done electronically. I also use Diigo, diigo.com. I've spoken to some of you before about it, for online bookmarking. And it takes a bit of time, you know. We all just want to read and go. But you start bookmarking that, and you do that over a number of years, it's amazing how much time it will save you when you come to any topic and you just go into Diigo, you put in your tag, and up come 20, 30, maybe more articles written by some of the best Christian writers in the world. Or it may be journal articles. For example, myself, when I read through journals, I put a sticky, what do you call these things?
Sticky note.
Yeah, with a little page number, and I get my assistant to scan it in, PDF it, and send it into Evernote with a tag and a title on it. So that again, if I want to study something more in depth, there's a bank of that, and I'm not, where do I start? Where do you start on the internet? You put in Lord's Supper on the internet, there's just no point. You got all weird and wonderful stuff. If I have noticed recently, I don't know if you've noticed this, you put in searches for like the person and work of Christ or something like that. You know what comes up first? LDS. Latter-day Saints. The Mormons have managed to get their search results way up to the top of Google on issues to do with Jesus Christ. So that's why you need your own Google, basically. And that's what Digo is. It's your own personal Google that you're building up. And it cuts through all the trash and the garbage and gets you to the gold. Yeah.
What you mentioned, I've thought about that myself for a long time, but I wouldn't know how to begin. Would you contemplate the idea of showing how you do it yourself?
Yeah, sure.
Eventually?
Yep. If you remind me tomorrow, I'll start with that, okay? Number 5, follows a regular pattern. Maybe I've said enough about this today. And to help you remember, there is a bit of alliteration going on here. Follows a regular pattern. One of the reasons I wrote How Sermons Work is because I felt that so many homiletics books dealt with every subject independently, and it left students sort of having to piece it all together. And the reason I did How Sermons Work is that I just wanted a step-by-step for basic homiletics. It's not. It's like the most basic homiletics book out there. But I wanted to produce a book that you could create checklists and step-by-steps from, and start with that until it became more second nature, more instinctive to you. So you get used to a pattern. The more you do that, the less you need the book. You get into a mindset, a way of thinking. It just becomes automatic. I used to do Taekwondo before I had these blood clot issues, and every time I went up a belt, you do another form, and you're doing it like you feel as if you're that robot in the Wizard of Oz, just like you just don't know where to put your arms or legs, and so you're doing everything at about 1 mile per hour, and you think, well, I will never get this form perfected, and never get up another belt. But it was amazing how every time, repetition, built a memory in the muscles, so that they knew sort of where to go eventually within about 3 or 4 weeks. And eventually you're going through it at quite a rate, hardly thinking about it, and the muscles have been trained to know exactly where to go and what to clench and what combination, what timing. And it actually becomes completely boring, and painfully so. But this is what we need in sermon prep to some extent as well, a routine, a pattern that, feels a bit awkward at first and slow, and what's getting next? But eventually it just becomes automatic and instinctive. And you sit in your chair, your brain knows, okay, it's time to go into this dimension. We start whirring in this direction. And the more routine we build into sermon preparation, the more routine it will become. But here's the difference between that and Taekwondo. Yes, the process is routine and boring. But when you're preaching, you're dealing with material that eventually, when you get so used to the routine's not even there. Like, it's the skeleton you don't see. And instead, you can just focus on the material, and that's where the joy and the pleasure is. So find your own routine. I've given you one today. I've tried to give you hints from other students. You'll get more in other homiletics books. Number 6. I don't know, is Michael Barrett coming into this class after me? Who's next here? Oh, well. Is pragmatic about biblical languages. I teach Hebrew exegesis, I love Hebrew, I want you to use Hebrew in sermon prep, but I also want to be realistic. When I started in ministry again, I used to spend hours parsing verbs. I remember it used to take me about 2 hours to parse the verbs in Hebrew. And again, there was no electronic help, so I was using a hardback. Looking up lexicons, usually for like 10, 15 verses as a pericope. And I ended up with lots and lots of lovely Hebrew study, but no sermon. So I've tried to adopt a method which I believe still places great importance on the study of God's word in the original languages, but at the same time increases our time efficiency. So I'm very much against abandoning Greek and Hebrew. They're essential, but I am for repositioning them in the process, especially in the early days of our ministries, while we grow in knowledge. Now, if you try to be a Lambden or a Wenham while trying to preach 3 sermons a week, again, you're going down the hole of burnout. And if you try to be idealistic about the use of biblical languages, I'll tell you what will happen. You won't only burn out, you'll give up the original languages. As the vast majority, 95% of seminary students do. That's the reality. 95% do not consult the original languages in the preparation of a sermon. And the reason is they found it too time consuming because they were trying to do it in an idealistic way. So I have a more realistic approach, I believe, to using the original languages. I'm noticing the time, and so I'll pick this up tomorrow and reveal all. And you can think of me as a heretic overnight, and I'll try and recover my reputation tomorrow. But let's return to this tomorrow. I'll finish this lecture and then we'll go on to the text, choosing a text. Okay? Any brief questions? Paul? What are you looking at? Yep. Okay. Yep. How to vary your text.
I'm not objecting, I'm just saying it's that if I understand correctly.
Well, I'm sorry, Paul. I'm not picking this up properly. Maybe somebody else getting it. I'm not.
Okay, when we watch the videos before the
Right. Okay.
I was taking notes on the outline that we've got.
You can do that. But all the material is in how sermons work as well. So I think it's useful to watch the videos, listen and read. Get it in both ways. Eye gate, ear gate, paper, video.
Is there any intended correspondence between the videos and the lecture?
Should be. Yep.
Right, okay.
I'll check it when I go back upstairs, okay? But there should be.
Can I ask check.
I don't have my, unfortunately, I don't have my laptop here, Paul.
Yeah, it's not an objection, just to check.
Right. I will check.
Right.
Okay. And if there's something missing, I'll fix it. Right?
You've mentioned a couple times now that the videos are virtually the equivalent of the book.
Yeah.
Do we have the option of just reading the book and not watching the videos?
I know it's painful, Ryan.
No, I'm just
Yeah, I mean, all I want is material in, but in general, for most people, to get material in two ways seals the material better. But that may not be you, right? You know, everyone's a wee bit different in their learning style, and that's why I did both. When we used to do just the book, some people felt it was really dead and boring.
I just didn't know if to fulfill your requirements.
As long as you're able to demonstrate knowledge and assimilation, that's the main thing. Kenneth.
So there's no point, like the other day when I watched the videos, I started writing out notes, 2 pages, but you don't really need to do that then because it corresponds.
Well, the 2 videos from yesterday, there's nothing about that. So from now on, it's how sermons work. Okay? Are we done? Okay. Paul, why don't you?
Endure in it, Father, not just be able to do it for a short time,